Get in the car. She didn't move, just stared at him like he'd said something in a language she hadn't learned yet. The rain was coming down sideways. Not the polite kind of rain that falls straight and predictable, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck, that soaks through denim in under a minute, that makes the whole world feel like it's trying to push you underground. It was past midnight on the I-95 shoulder somewhere between exit 14 and the rest of the world, and Vaughn Mallory had not planned to stop. He never stopped, not for anything. But there she was. A woman standing beside a rusted sedan that listed slightly to the left, its hazard lights blinking orange into the dark like a distress signal no one was answering. She had a phone pressed to her ear and the look of someone who had already been told no 3 times tonight and was working up the nerve to try a 4th. Her dark hair was plastered to her face. She was wearing scrubs, pale blue, soaked nearly black, and the kind of hospital-grade sneakers that were never meant to stand in 2 inches of road runoff. Vaughn's silver Range Rover slowed without him making a conscious decision. His hands just eased off the gas. He told himself it was because the shoulder was narrow and he didn't want to clip her mirror. He told himself that for about 4 seconds before he pulled over. He stepped out and immediately the rain hit him like something personal. "You need a tow," he called over the sound of water on pavement. She lowered the phone and looked at him the way people look at strangers on dark highways, measuring, uncertain, ready to say no. "I've got one coming," she said. 45 minutes, maybe an hour." He glanced down the empty road, then back at her. "You're planning to stand here for an hour." "I'm fine." Her teeth were chattering, just barely, but he caught it. "Get in the car," he said again, and this time it wasn't a question. She stiffened. "I don't know you." "Vaughn Mallory." He held out his hand in the rain like this was a networking event and not a highway in a storm. "I run a logistics company out of Hartford. I have a LinkedIn profile and a terrible golf handicap, and I am not going to leave you on the side of the road in the middle of the night. You can call someone while you wait in the heat." She looked at his hand for a long moment, then at his face, then at the empty road stretching off in both directions. "The back seat," she said finally. "Wherever you want." Her name was June Calloway. She told him that after she'd settled in and the heat vents had been pointed in her direction and she'd stopped shaking enough to type her tow company's callback number into her own phone. She said it the way people give their names when they're doing it out of obligation and mild suspicion. First name, last name. No room for follow-up. She was a nurse. Night shift, Hartford General. The car had started making a sound 2 weeks ago that she'd been meaning to get checked, and tonight the sound had turned into a hard pull to the right and then a shudder, and then nothing at all on the shoulder of a highway where apparently 45 minutes was the best anyone could do. Vaughn didn't push for more. He turned the music down and let the rain do the talking, and she sat behind him with her phone in her lap and her eyes on the window, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything useful. When the tow arrived, it was closer to 65 minutes. She got out to deal with it, and he got out too, standing in the rain holding an umbrella over her while she talked to the driver and signed the form and watched her car get loaded onto the flatbed with the resigned expression of someone watching a small tragedy they'd seen coming for a while. "Where are you taking it?" Vaughn asked the driver. The man named a shop 2 towns over. "Earliest I can get to it is Thursday." June's face didn't change much, but something behind her eyes went quiet in a way that Vaughn recognized. The math of a bad week. Car, repair cost, missed shifts, the calculation happening fast and landing somewhere uncomfortable. "I can get you home tonight," Vaughn said. "I've got it. It's raining. I've noticed." He waited. She looked at the empty flatbed pulling away with her car, then at her phone, then at the road. Then she looked at him with an expression that said she was too tired to argue with someone determined. "Fine," she said, for the second time that night. She lived in a small neighborhood in Wethersfield, in a first-floor apartment with a porch light that buzzed when he pulled up. She got out before he could say anything, then turned back and looked at him through the open door. "Thank you," she said, seriously. "Don't mention it." She started toward the steps, then stopped. "You should have just kept driving." "Probably," he said. She almost smiled. Then the door swung shut and the buzzing porch light swallowed her up, and Vaughn sat in the driveway for a moment longer than made sense before he finally pulled away. He told himself he'd forgotten about her by the time he reached the highway. He hadn't. Vaughn Mallory had spent the better part of his adult life being precise. It was, depending on who you asked, either his greatest professional asset or the thing that made him difficult to be around at dinner parties. He built Mallory Logistics from a 2-truck operation out of his uncle's garage into a mid-Atlantic freight company with 112 employees and contracts with 3 national retailers. He did it by being exact, by measuring twice, cutting once, by knowing exactly how much slack to give and when to pull tight. He had not, in 14 years of running that company, made a decision he couldn't explain. He could not explain why he kept thinking about June Calloway. It wasn't attraction, or it wasn't only that. It was something more specific, something about the way she'd stood on that highway shoulder, foam pressed to her ear, rain coming down, and still managed to look like a woman who was handling it. Like handling it was just the thing you did because no one was coming, because no one ever came, and so you stood in the rain and you waited and you handled it. He knew that look. He'd grown up watching it on his grandmother's face, in the kitchen of a house in Bridgeport, where the heat went out every January and the landlord stopped picking up around November. She had been a home health aide for 31 years. She used to come home from 12-hour shifts and still make dinner, still ask how his day was, still find something to laugh about over the news. He'd asked her once, when he was maybe 10 years old, why she never seemed tired. She'd looked at him with a patience that bordered on amused. "Baby," she said, "tired is a luxury for people who have someone else to carry the weight." He'd been carrying his own weight since he was 12. He understood the math. He was 38 now, and the weight had shifted forms. It was board meetings and quarterly reviews in a condo in Hartford with very good views and very little in the refrigerator. It was a company that needed him more than he needed it, and a life that was structured and successful and almost entirely hollow in the specific way that lives become hollow when you fill them with the right things and forget to leave room for anything real. He was not looking for anything real. He'd learned not to want what he couldn't plan for. Then he drove past Hartford General at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning, on his way to a meeting he was already early for, and he saw her again. She was coming out of the side entrance, the one the staff used, in her coat and her scrubs and the same worn sneakers. She had a travel mug in one hand and her bag on her shoulder, and the look of someone who had just finished a very long night and was now computing whether the bus came at 7:20 or 7:25. He pulled to the curb before he'd thought it through. She saw him, and her expression did something complicated. Not warm, not cold, somewhere in the vicinity of carefully neutral. "Mr. Mallory." "Vaughn." He leaned across the console. "You waiting for a bus?" "Yes." "Where are you headed?" A pause. "Home." "Wethersfield?" Another pause, longer this time, with a slight narrowing of the eyes that suggested she was recalibrating whether this qualified as alarming. "How do you remember that?" "I drove you there," he said simply. "Get in. I'm going past it." "You don't know where I live exactly." "Close enough." She stood on the curb with her travel mug and her bag and the morning light coming through the trees, and for a moment she looked like she was going to say no, like she'd assembled the no already and just needed to deliver it. Then the bus stop behind her was empty, and the next bus was probably not 7:20. She got in. They didn't talk much. She was tired in the boneless way that comes after a full night shift, and he'd learned in the car on the highway that she wasn't someone who made conversation for its own sake. He liked that about her. He didn't tell her that. He dropped her off at Wethersfield and watched her walk up the porch steps without looking back, and then he drove to his meeting and sat through 45 minutes of supply chain restructuring and contributed almost nothing useful, which was noticed, because Vaughn Mallory always contributed something useful. He started taking that route to work every Tuesday and Thursday. He told himself it was because of the new traffic light configuration on Asylum Avenue. It wasn't. The third time he saw her at that bus stop, he stopped and she got in with less hesitation, and somewhere around the fourth time she brought him a coffee from the hospital vending machine. Terrible coffee, the kind that tastes like the machine itself, and handed it to him through the window before she got in. And something about that small, unsentimental gesture did something to the inside of his chest that he couldn't name right away. He knew what it was. He just wasn't ready to call it that yet. Her car came back from the shop on a Friday. She texted him to let him know she'd given him her number the second week out of practicality, she said, in case traffic was bad. He'd told her that was very sensible. She'd told him not to push it. He responded to the text with, "Good. Take it easy this weekend." She didn't respond, which was fine. He sat with his phone in his hand in his office for longer than was warranted by a text about a repaired car. He hadn't told her about the car. He'd found out who did the repair through the tow company. It hadn't been difficult, just a phone call and a politely worded explanation that he was a friend of the owner. He'd called the shop directly and covered the balance. Told them not to mention it. The shop hadn't mentioned it. He didn't do it to impress her. She didn't know, so it couldn't impress her. He did it because the math of her situation was bad and he could make it less bad without making it strange, and that felt like the precise kind of thing a person did when they had more than they needed and they weren't an idiot about it. He also, quietly, without drawing attention to it, made a call to a colleague on the Hartford General Board about the hospital's parking situation for night shift staff. There had been a lot of complaints he'd heard about the structure being under construction and nurses being rerouted to a surface lot 3 blocks away. A week later, the construction company expedited the ramp reopening by 2 weeks. Vaughn didn't mention it to anyone. He had learned from his grandmother that the most useful things you could do for people were usually the ones they never had to thank you for. She used to say, "The best help doesn't ask for a witness." He thought about her often, his grandmother. She died when he was 22, 8 months after he started the company, and the thing that still ached about it, quietly, in the way old injuries ache, was that she never got to see what he built. She would have liked seeing it. She would have made some dry observation about how he got his stubbornness, and then she would have been proud of him in that particular way she had, understated and total. He thought about her when he thought about June. That was the honest truth of it. Not because they were alike on the surface, they weren't, but because they both carried their weight the same way, like it was simply the shape of things, like complaining about it would be beside the point. He was falling for June Calloway in the specific, inconvenient way you fall for someone when you spend a long time telling yourself you're fine alone, not in a rush, not with dramatics, just the slow realization that certain things, the morning commute, a bad cup of coffee, the specific kind of quiet that comes after a long week, had started to feel different when she was part of them. He didn't tell her any of this. He brought her dinner instead. Nothing elaborate. He'd stopped at a diner near Hartford General that a colleague had recommended, got a bag of food and left it at the nurse's station with her name on it one evening when she was mid-shift and probably hadn't eaten since morning. No note, just her name on the bag. She texted him at 11:30 that night. "Did you do that?" He waited a full minute before responding. "Do what?" "Vaughn. You needed to eat." A long pause. "Then you're very strange." He found himself smiling at his phone in an empty office at 11:30 at night, which was, he thought, either a very good sign or a very bad one. It wasn't until November that things started to shift in the wrong direction. He had driven her to a farmer's market on a Saturday morning. She'd mentioned it casually, not as an invitation, just as a thing she was planning to do, and he had said he'd been meaning to go, which was a complete fabrication, but she let him come along without calling him on it, and they'd spent 2 hours walking between tables of apples and local honey and handmade candles. She bought a jar of apple butter. He bought nothing and carried her bag. She had laughed at something he said, really laughed, the kind that scrunches the corners of her eyes, and he had looked at her in the November morning light and thought, "I am completely in over my head." Then she'd stopped in front of a table of pressed flower arrangements and gone quiet in that particular way she did when something had hit a nerve, and he'd waited, and after a moment she'd said, "My mom used to make these." He didn't say anything, just stood beside her. "She died when I was 19, June said, still looking at the flowers. That's when I decided to be a nurse, so I could do what she couldn't do anymore, be present with people who needed it." He nodded slowly. "I know that probably sounds." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, like she was reading something in his face she hadn't expected to find there. That was the afternoon. Everything deepened in a way that made both of them quiet on the drive home. But he still didn't say the thing he was thinking. He dropped her off. She thanked him. The porch light buzzed like it always did. He sat in the driveway too long and then drove home to his very orderly condo with its very good views and sat at his kitchen table and did not sleep until 3 in the morning. He was afraid. That was the plain truth. Not of her, of what happened when you let yourself need someone and then they were gone. He had a list of examples and they were not abstract. They were specific and named, and they had all taught him the same thing. You learn to need someone, and then the world takes its cut. It always takes its cut. He was afraid that if he said anything out loud, the way he'd learned to stop saying things out loud, he would ruin it. Or she would leave. Or both. So he stayed on the near side of honest. He stayed careful. For months, he stayed careful. The night he nearly lost her entirely started with a phone call. He'd been in a budget meeting when his assistant knocked and held up his phone. The kind of knock that meant this is interrupting you no matter what, and on the screen was a Hartford General number he didn't recognize. His stomach dropped before he answered. She'd been in an accident. Not serious, the voice told him, but not nothing either. A collision at an intersection. The other driver had run a red, and June had been brought in as a patient to the same hospital she worked in, which she later told him was mortifying, which was so exactly her that he'd almost laughed despite himself. He was in the hospital parking garage in 22 minutes. He had a clear memory of the drive, of the elevator, of the hallway, but almost no memory of what he thought about during any of it. His mind was very quiet and very focused and moving very fast, which was how his mind worked in emergencies, and the emergency he was focused on was getting to her. She was in a bed in the third bay, awake and annoyed about it, her left arm wrapped, a bruise already starting across her cheekbone. She looked at him when he walked through the curtain, and her expression did the complicated thing it sometimes did when she didn't know whether to be glad or guarded. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know. They called you. You had me listed as an emergency contact." He sat down beside her. "You changed it 2 months ago." She had, in fact. She'd mentioned it matter-of-factly one morning in the car, the way she mentioned most things as information, not emotion, which he'd come to understand was her way of saying something that mattered. "Still," she said. "Still nothing." He looked at her arm. "What do the doctors say?" "It's a sprain, mild concussion. I'll be fine." "You'll be." "Don't," she said, which stopped him. Her voice had an edge in it that wasn't quite anger, something underneath anger, something rawer. "Don't do the thing where you get upset on my behalf. I can't." She stopped, looked away. "I can't have you care about me like this and not say anything, Vaughn. I don't know what this is. I don't know what you want. I don't know if I'm She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "A project, or something real." The word landed in the center of his chest like a stone in still water. He sat with it for a second. He deserved it. "You're not a project," he said. "Then what am I?" He looked at her, bruised, exhausted, furious in the way that people only get furious when they're actually scared, and the thing he'd been holding carefully for the better part of a year decided, on its own, that it was done being held. "The most important part of my day," he said. "Have been for a long time now." She stared at him. "I've been scared," he said, which was not the kind of thing he said out loud, ever. I don't do this well. I don't know how. I've been trying to show you without having to say it because saying it out loud means it's real, and when things are real, they can." He stopped. "I've lost people. I know how that goes." June looked at him for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was quieter. "I've been carrying everything alone since I was 19 years old," she said. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to show up. That's it. Just show up and say so." He nodded slowly. "Say so," she said again. "Not gentle. Clear." "I love you," he said. "I've known it for months, and I've been too careful to say it. I'm done being careful about this." The curtain shifted in the hospital draft. The monitors beeped down the hall. She looked at him, and something in her face, the edge, the wariness, went soft in a way he hadn't seen before. "Okay," she said quietly. Okay? Okay. She looked down at her wrapped arm. You're still going to have to stop doing things for me without telling me. Some things. Most things. We can negotiate. She almost smiled. You paid for my car. He said nothing. The shop slipped, she said. The guy thought I knew. A pause. The parking ramp at the hospital. That was a board-level decision. You called the board. He met her eyes. You were walking 3 blocks alone at midnight. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head, not angry, something closer to undone. You could have just said something. Any of it. I know. He reached over and very carefully, very deliberately took her good hand in his. I'm saying it now. She didn't pull away. She looked down at their hands and then back up at him. You're going to have to learn how to let me carry things too, she said. That's how this works. I know. You don't know. But you'll learn. He held her hand in that fluorescent-lit hospital bay while the night shift moved around them, and for the first time in a long time he wasn't afraid of what happened when you needed someone. They didn't make a formal announcement about anything. They didn't need to. Things shifted gradually, the way things do when 2 people stop performing carefulness and start just being together. She kept her apartment in Wethersfield for 4 more months. Then one weekend she was reorganizing his kitchen because he'd been putting the mugs in the wrong cabinet, and she looked up and said, "Why do I pay rent somewhere else?" And he said he'd been wondering the same thing, and that was that. He learned what she meant when she said he needed to let her carry things. It turned out it meant calling her when a deal fell through, instead of just going silent for 3 days. It meant telling her when he was anxious about the Q3 numbers instead of just getting up at 5 in the morning and working until the anxiety had somewhere to go. It meant letting her notice when something was wrong and not deflecting. It was harder than he expected. He was not naturally built for it. But she was patient in the way that only someone who has dealt with her share of difficult things can be patient, not indulgent, but real. She didn't let him off the hook. She just stayed on the hook with him. He took her to Bridgeport in February, to the street where his grandmother had lived, to the house that was different now under different owners. He told her about the heat going out every January and the landlord who stopped picking up and a 10-year-old boy who learned that some weights are just yours to carry. He told her about the nurse in the family who worked 31 years and never called it a sacrifice. He told her why he'd stopped on a highway in the rain. June stood on that sidewalk with her hands in her coat pockets and listened to the whole thing, and when he was done she didn't try to fix it or comment on it. She just put her hand in his, and they stood there for a while in the February cold, on the street where it had started, or at least where part of it had started. She would have liked you, he said. How do you know? June asked. You're the same, he said. You carry things without making it about the carrying. She was quiet for a moment. You learned how to see that from her. He hadn't thought of it that way before. He turned it over. I suppose I did. Then she would have liked me, June said simply, because she'd know you finally figured out who to look for. They got married the following October, on a Saturday morning when the Connecticut leaves had gone gold and amber and the air had that specific clarity that only happens in early fall. It wasn't a large event, 30 people, a backyard ceremony at a house they'd rented in Simsbury, a caterer who did an unreasonable amount with roasted vegetables, and a playlist June had built herself that started with Stevie Wonder and ended with something slow and old that neither of them could name, but both of them knew. Bond's assistant gave a toast that was too long but genuinely funny. A colleague from Hartford General who'd been June's friend since nursing school cried during the ceremony and then claimed she hadn't. The elderly couple from next door in Wethersfield, who June had driven to doctor's appointments twice a month since they'd lost their car, came and sat in the front row and brought a casserole that no one had asked for, and everyone was glad to have. Bond's vows were short. He wasn't a man who performed well in front of crowds, and he'd spent a long time on the draft before finally deciding the honest version was better than the polished one. He said, I spent a long time thinking I was protecting myself by staying quiet. What I was actually doing was staying empty. You didn't try to fix that. You just stood close enough that I could see the difference. I am going to spend the rest of my life learning how to say the things you deserve to hear. June looked at him through the whole thing without looking away. Her vows were longer, funnier. There was a running thread about his terrible coffee-making technique and the mug cabinet situation that got a laugh from everyone who knew them. But at the end, she turned serious, the way she turned serious, like turning a page. She said, "I've been taking care of people my whole life. I didn't think someone would take care of me. I didn't think I knew how to let them. You figured out how to do it quietly, which is the only way I would have let you. I love you for knowing that. I love you for learning everything else." He didn't say anything. He just held her hands like he was keeping them warm. Later that night, when the last guests had gone and the backyard lights were strung golden over empty chairs, they sat together on the porch steps with 2 very good glasses of wine and the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. She leaned into his shoulder. "You almost didn't stop," she said. "I know." "What made you?" He thought about it for a while, the real answer, not the easy one. "You looked like someone who was handling it," he said. "And I knew what that looked like from the inside." She was quiet for a moment. "You recognized it," she said. "Yeah. Because you'd been doing it too. For a long time." She turned her face up to the October sky and he put his arm around her, and the night was quiet the way nights get when everything important has already been said. He hadn't stopped for a stranger on a highway. He'd stopped for someone who reminded him of every person he'd ever loved who carried more than their share and never asked for help. He'd stopped because something in him had recognized something in her, that particular human weight, and had decided for the first time in years to not keep driving. It was the least calculated thing he had ever done. It was the best decision of his life. I keep thinking about the moment Vaughn almost didn't stop. He said it himself on those porch steps on their wedding night. He had no reason to pull over. He had somewhere to be, or at least the habit of going somewhere, the kind of forward momentum that successful people mistake for purpose. And June was handling it. That was the thing. She was standing in the rain, soaking wet, on the shoulder of a dark highway, and she was handling it. So it would have been easy, even reasonable, to keep driving. What stopped him wasn't pity. It wasn't attraction. It was recognition. He saw something in her that he knew from the inside, the particular posture of a person who has learned not to wait for help because help doesn't usually come. He'd worn that posture himself for most of his life. His grandmother had worn it for 31 years and called it just the shape of things. That recognition, the ability to actually see another person, not just look at them, is something you can only develop if you've done the harder work first. Vaughn had spent years building something real, a company, a reputation, a life of substance. But more than that, he'd built a quality of attention. He noticed things. He paid attention to what people actually needed, not what was convenient to offer. That kind of intelligence isn't born. It's grown, slowly, usually by people who've had to figure things out without much help. And June, I think about what it took for her to get in that car. She was tired and wet and mistrustful for good reasons, and she got in anyway. Not because she was naive, but because she was smart enough to weigh the actual risk against the actual cold. That's a different kind of intelligence, practical, unsentimental, honest. The same intelligence that kept her working night shifts and volunteering on weekends and driving her elderly neighbors to appointments nobody asked her to keep. She didn't do those things because she expected anything in return. She did them because she understood, in her bones, that the world runs on the people who show up. What undid both of them, what nearly cost them everything, was the thing they shared, the belief that needing someone was a liability. Vaughn stayed quiet for months because he was afraid that saying it out loud would make it real, and real things could be taken. June had been carrying her own weight since she was 19 and had stopped imagining that anyone would offer to share it. 2 people, both strong, both capable, both half-empty for the same reason. The turning point wasn't romantic. It was honest. June, bruised and exhausted in a hospital bay, said, "I can't have you care about me like this and not say anything." That took something most people don't talk about, a willingness to stay in the discomfort of not knowing and ask the question out loud anyway. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of courage there is. And Vaughn, who had built a life on precision and control, said, "I've been scared." 3 words that cost him more than any business decision he'd ever made. But he said them. What you give honestly, without motive, without performance, it comes back, not as magic, not as fate, but as consequence. Vaughn spent years quietly helping people who couldn't help him back. June spent years showing up for people who had nothing to offer. When they found each other, they were already the kind of people capable of something real. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. You don't stumble into a life like theirs. You build toward it, one unglamorous choice at a time, in the rain, on an empty highway, when nobody's watching.